All right, we'll get started in a moment once we give people a chance to get in here. As always, thanks so much for coming. Today we have David presenting, and then Emmanuel is going to be discussing. Just to give you a reminder, David's going to have around 40 minutes, Emmanuel around 15, and then there will be some time for questions at the end. That said, if you have questions throughout, what we're going to do is basically say, go ahead and put those in the chat, and then David is going to kind of pause every once in a while, and we'll try to maybe collect questions and answer them throughout. I guess if David's fine with this, if you have a very urgent like clarification question or something, you can probably just also unmute yourself and ask if that's all right with you, David.
Yeah, I'm perfectly happy to be interrupted at any point.
Awesome. Great. As always, we really appreciate if you can get your camera on just so that it's not a sad void for the presenters. If you can, but you know, I understand if you can't. So, but glad to have everyone here. And given it's 2 after, why don't we go ahead and say, David, take it away.
Sure thing. Thank you very much for having me. I guess a shout out to Tom Osterbro, who is actually calling in on his car. That's taking, participation to a new level. Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. Let me share my slides. Hopefully that is easy for everyone to see. This is joint work with Victor Bennett, who is now at the University of Utah. He is formerly my colleague in the strategy area here at Fuqua. I'm not sure Victor was able to join us today, so we won't be in the normal world of one co-author kind of reading the chat line and prompting for questions. So please, as Melanie said, please feel free to interrupt me at any point. I really welcome your comments and your questions and your thoughts, and I'm especially interested to hear what Emmanuel has to say later. Hopefully the title of this paper kind of says it all to some degree, but let me motivate what we're going to do here with a couple of facts. So these are data from the current population survey going from 1996 to 2020. And this is a pretty broad measure of entrepreneurship, which would include self-employment, or an entrepreneur, as many of us think of it. And the red line at the top is or white business owners, and the blue line at the bottom, starting at around 4%, are Black business owners. And so those proportions are proportions of that group's working age population. So you can see that Black self-employment is about a third to a half as common as white self-employment. That is sort of the broadest measure of self-employment you could think of. Here is a more narrow measure that zeroes in on high growth industries. So this is something that Rob Fairley and I put together for a piece we did for the Innovation Policy and the Economy series. And here you can see that the rates are lower for all groups, but again, white entrepreneurship rates are about 2 or 3 times higher than Black entrepreneurship rates. And so what might this be? So, people have proposed, there are a lot of sort of common explanations for this. One of the most common is that underrepresented groups have a more difficult time raising capital because they face some form of discrimination in the search for capital. Some people argue that the fact that underrepresented groups have a more difficult time accumulating net worth because they live in under-resourced communities or because of systemic constraints. Some have argued that that's a part of this story. And then some have argued that the returns to new business formation are lower because people live in under-resourced communities. And so what we want to try to do is unpack that a little bit. And I guess when most of the stories that you hear for why there would be a racial difference in rates of entrepreneurship, I think most of us kind of in the back of our mind have in mind some version of an Evans and Jovanovich framework, where a person is making kind of a choice between accepting wage employment or starting a business. And if you think about the Evans and Jovanovich framework, it's really nice in terms of framing hypotheses here, because the returns to being an entrepreneur in their framework are a function of how much capital you can raise for the business idea. So that's what you have there sort of in the second equation. The output from being an entrepreneur is a function of the productivity of the idea, as well as the capital that you apply to it. And in their frameworks, everyone's making a choice between earning a wage that's a function of their skills and other characteristics, or starting a business that's going to be a function of the amount of capital they can raise. What we want to do in this paper is basically take a more granular approach to this framework. So instead of just proposing it as a sort of a static coin flip, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, I'm going to be a wage earner. Instead, let's think about a world where someone has an idea that arrives with some probability. And when they have an idea for a business, they receive some noisy signal of, how productive that idea is, how good an idea that is. And then after they receive the noisy signal of their idea, they can take steps that come at a cost to sort of sharpen the signal and make a more informed decision about whether the entrepreneurial idea is better than their outside wage offer. So that's kind of the framework that we're going to have in the back of our mind. There's no model here, but if you just want to have a simple framework for organizing our thoughts, this would be kind of the framework that we have. And with a framework like this, you can see that in addition to the sort of the standard mechanisms, the availability of capital affecting the optimality of the choice in particular, we can try to zero in on alternative explanations. Like, for example, maybe ideas arrive at different rates for different groups. Maybe the expected quality of an idea differs across different groups for the reasons we discussed on the previous slide. Or maybe the precision, maybe the precision of the signal you receive differs, and differences in risk aversion or other traits like that are important for affecting the decision. And finally, maybe the cost to sharpen the signal varies across different groups. So what we're going to do is basically conduct a survey that breaks this decision to become an entrepreneur down into this more granular framework that I've kind of laid out for you. So in particular, we're going to ask respondents, have you ever considered starting a business? Yes or no? If so, what steps have you taken? And so before I go further, I should say, we're going to conduct this survey. We're going to conduct a nationally representative survey. And it's going to include people who are entrepreneurs and people who are not currently entrepreneurs. So we're going to ask everyone the question, have you ever considered starting a business? And the ones who answer yes to that question, we're going to say, okay, what steps did you take? And there are about 16 or 18 different steps that we're going to measure. But in broad terms, you can think about these steps as falling into 4 basic buckets. The first bucket would be socializing the idea, talking to your friends about it, talking to an expert in the area about it. That would be socializing the idea. The next step after that would be codifying the idea. So, for example, writing a business plan, drawing up financials, something like that. That's codifying the idea, writing it down in a way that allows you to pass it along to other people. The third broad bucket we're going to look at is market testing the idea. So building a prototype, getting customer feedback, trying to assess the degree of competition in the market, things like that. And then the final step we're going to look at is taking administrative, legal, or financial steps to start a business. So getting a tax ID, getting an attorney, raising financing from a bank, or applying to an accelerator, something like that. So we're going to look at the various steps that you've taken. We're also going to measure your expectations about the idea. And then we're going to basically find out whether you started the business. And so for us, starting the business is going to be, did you make a sale? Did you quit your job? Or have you hired an employee to launch this? And if you say no to that question, we're going to ask why not. So that's basically the broad survey framework. And let me just kind of highlight what the key results are that we're going to find in the paper. And then maybe I'll pause after that and take questions or comments. So so I've shown you already that some of you already knew, which is that rates of Black self-employment are below rates of white self-employment. Let's break that down into two steps: considering starting a business, and then starting a business conditional on having considered one. If you think about the first step, just considering starting a business, what we see is that Blacks are about 30% more likely than whites to report considering starting a business. So in other words, that goes from a baseline of about 31%. 31% of white respondents indicate that they have considered starting a business, and around 43% of Black respondents report that they've considered starting a business. You get a smaller effect, but it goes in the same direction for Hispanic respondents. Hispanics are about 16% more likely. Women, in contrast, are considerably less likely to report that they've considered starting a business. And the numbers that I'm pointing to you to there that's after we've controlled for things like education, employment status, income, age, and where you live. So, it's not the case that Black respondents are less likely to consider starting a business. That's not the story. They're more likely to consider starting a business, but conditional on starting a business, they're considerably less likely to actually do it. So the mean rate of business formation is around 12% in our sample, and Black respondents are about 3% less likely than white respondents to start the business conditional on considering it. Comparing to other underrepresented groups, the effect is even stronger for Hispanics, but there's no difference in business starting rates for women once we condition on having considered starting a business. So then what are the reasons for this? We look kind of at a couple of broad reasons why you might see this. There's no indication that Black respondents expect worse business outcomes. In other words, it's not that they receive a draw of theta and say, okay, this was a bad draw, I considered it, but I don't think this is a very good idea. If anything, they expect better outcomes than white respondents. There is some evidence that differential access to resources matters. And in particular, what we see is that the results I'm going to show you are concentrated among lower income respondents. But when we look at direct measures of access, like going to a bank or applying to an accelerator or something, we see no evidence of racial difference there. Where we do see a big difference is it appears that among Black respondents, there's an avoidance of seeking informal feedback from peers. So in other words, when I said like the first broad bucket of steps that people take are socialization steps. What you see in the survey responses is that the patterns of socialization among Black respondents are different than for white respondents and for women. And so let me pause there and just see if there are questions from the floor. I don't have my chat window open, but
nothing currently in the chat, but if anyone has a question, feel free to unmute yourself. Oh, Brad.
Yeah, so I'm curious in the possible reasons, particularly given the interaction that you get with income, is just that low-income minorities feel more stressed in the traditional labor market. Therefore, they're more likely to consider entrepreneurship as an alternative.
That's certainly one interpretation.
That's quite different from access to resources, though. That's lack of options in the labor market.
That's correct. Yeah. I don't see differences. This is something that we can dig into more for sure. We don't see we don't see big differences depending on how we stratify based on your current employment status. So it is not the case that the results I'm showing you are coming from the pool of unemployed Black respondents being different than the pool of unemployed white respondents. It's not coming there, but I take your point.
Just to follow on with that,
Absolutely.
though, but Blacks may view their labor situation as more tenuous.
Oh, more tenuous.
And-
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm jotting down some notes.
And the other thing that I missed the very first, but I think that the gap between Blacks and whites has narrowed in the last couple of years.
It has. Here, since you missed it, I'll just go back quickly because it's relevant to the story. So this is for basically all types of employment: employer, non-employer businesses, incorporated, unincorporated businesses. And the red line is white self-employment. The blue line is Black self-employment, and it has narrowed, the gap has narrowed. But the reason I wanted to return to this is that it's that narrowing gap is as much due to lower rates of self-employment among whites as it is to higher rates of self-employment among Blacks.
What's the endpoint on the right there?
2020.
Thank you. So, yeah, when I thought it was post-pandemic. During the pandemic, the rates have considerably narrowed. So I'm not.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Rob Fairley has some interesting work on this. That's exactly
so
right.
that was my point, actually, that I was curious where the endpoint on that graph was. I did see that.
So David, I'm sure you'll tell us later, but is it about, self-employment, or is it starting a business with employees? So plumbers or Googles.
We don't see, I'll show you based on the evidence we have on their expectations of the business that they are envisioning employer businesses when they respond to this. But I don't have the kind of industry classifications or business model classifications that you might like to see. That's just going to be a limitation of the data that we have. Okay. Maybe with that, I'll press on a bit, and please just feel free to unmute yourself and just lob questions at me if you wish. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the related literature. It's vast, and it connects to the obvious literatures in occupational choice and entry into self-employment. But also more recent literatures on, where do entrepreneurial ideas come from, and thinking about spillovers in the workplace and stuff like that, learning and peer effects and stuff. And, in a shameless nod to the seminar organizers, Melanie has a really interesting paper on that, which I'm going to return to towards the end of the talk. Let me now tell you a little bit more about the data. So we have so the data for this paper, the origins of this paper were in a paper that Victor did with my colleague Ronnie Chatterjee that appeared in the Strategic Management Journal. And what they were trying to do is look at the various steps that people took going from considering an idea to starting an idea. And they were interested in approaching that from, sort of questions related to strategy in terms of, lean startup steps versus other types of steps. So for their paper, they had a sample that was nationally representative and taken from a broad cross-section. The data are coming to us through Qualtrics panels that were built with the samples that were built with the assistance of the Kauffman Foundation. So their paper used one sample. For this paper, we're taking their data and we're adding a second sample on top of it that was focusing on 10 different metro markets. In combination, we have about 52,000 respondents. Of those, around 16,000 considered starting a business, and 4,200 roughly either made a sale, quit their job to start the business, or hired an employee. And when you ask people why you didn't quit your job, some say, well, I started the business. I don't need to quit my job to run it. Others say, I still plan to launch the business. I just haven't taken all the necessary steps yet. And then a smaller group says that they're not pursuing the idea anymore. These rates of entrepreneurial activity are similar to what are reported in the BLS estimates of new establishments. So it's on the sort of the right order of magnitude in terms of other surveys. And the key difference here with other sort of pre-entrepreneurship surveys is that, for example, the panel study of entrepreneurial dynamics screens out individuals who don't reach the point of actually starting a business. And that's an important thing that here we want to understand why people fall off the path along the way. And that, like, the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor doesn't have any documentation of the steps or impediments that people faced. So here is, let me see, I think maybe in the interest of time, let me jump here. I'm going to show you results that have a series of controls in place and all the specifications I show you. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to have dummies for these different income categories. I'm going to have dummies for these age categories, and I'm going to have dummies for these education categories. And when I talk about splitting, the sample at median income, I'm going to break it at $75,000, which is sort of the closest break point here to the national median income. So let me, without further ado, then let me turn to the main result. And this is really pretty simple to show. In the first 4 columns, the dependent variable is a dummy variable for whether a respondent considered starting a business. And the 4 columns differ in terms of the estimation sample. So in the first column, it's everybody. Columns 2 and 3 break above and below median income, that $75,000 mark. And then for comparison purposes, column 4 looks at people who currently work in a startup. I don't mean the business that they started, but they work in a business that is less than 5 years old. And what you can see is that so all of these specifications have all of the dummies I showed you on the previous slide in place. And really the coefficients of interest are these 3 here: Black, Hispanic, female. So the omitted category is white or Asian male. And what you can see is that Black respondents are, that's a point estimate, but I showed you the magnitudes before. The consideration rate goes from about 30% to about 42%. They're much more likely than white males to report having considered starting a business. That result gets stronger for above median income, but is still roughly the same magnitude for below median income people. And Brad, coming back to your point, I don't want to overplay my hand here, but given that the point estimates are stronger for the wealthier part of the sample, that makes me think that the fear of the tenuous nature of wage employment is maybe only part of the story, not the whole thing here. Column 4, you can see that if you work in a business that's less than 5 years old, you still get a similar point estimate. When I compare that with Hispanic respondents, the Hispanic respondent, that result goes kind of in the same direction, but is generally around around half the magnitude. And then when you look at female respondents, you see the opposite pattern. Females are less likely to report that they considered starting a business. In columns 5 through 8, we look at the sample who answered yes to did you consider, and then we look at whether you have started the business. And there you can see that Black respondents are less likely to report that they started the business conditional on considering it. And as I said before, columns 6 and 7 show you that's a result that is clustered in below median income respondents. And so if you thought that working in a startup gave you access to a knowledge set that was relevant for starting a new business, you might think that this result would be dramatically attenuated for people who worked in startups. Because if you had an idea for a business and you worked in a startup, then you were surrounded by people who were sort of had a startup mindset, and you had access to information about how to launch a business. We don't see it happening. We don't see working. If you work in a startup, it does not attenuate that result. Brad.
Just curious, did you look at interactions of intersectionality of race and gender?
No, I did not. We don't have
A big enough sample.
Yeah, you get small cell counts when you start to condition down on consideration.
Understood.
Yeah. Thank you. So that's kind of the main result. In broad terms, Black respondents are more likely than white respondents to report considering a business, but less likely to start conditional on considering it. Let me now try to say a little bit about why that might be. So Aubrey, you were asking a question about employer businesses versus non-employer businesses. And I've got two questions that are going to try to capture optimism about the future prospects of the business. And one of them is based on employees as a measure of size. So one of the questions we asked was, when you were considering the idea, how many employees did you expect your business to have 5 years after founding? I'm going to flag a dummy for whether you answered 1 to 5 employees. A second measure of pessimism or optimism would be idea quality. How do you think a business based on your idea or your actual business, if you started it, compares to the average new firm in the industry in terms of being able to survive for 5 years? I'll flag if you responded much better than average 5-year survival rate. And I'm going to run just the same regression I ran before in terms of the controls and the key variables of interest. And what you can see is that Black respondents are much more likely to report much better than average belief about survival, and are much less likely to report that the business would have only 1 to 5 employees. So there are a number of ways to interpret this. I mean, one is to say, well, this is a grass is greener argument. I didn't start the business, and I think differently about how it could be because of that. But nonetheless, really all we're asking of this table is, does it offer pessimism as an explanation for the rates of business starting being lower among the group who are Black? And the pessimism story doesn't explain the result. So then if we ask people, why haven't you started the business yet? You could have answered, you can sort of see the following reasons. These are just shorthand for the answers that they were asked to check. Financing was difficult to obtain. it turned out that the business, it was too hard. After they looked around more, they recognized that there was too much competition. They could see what they needed to do next, but they lacked the skills to take the business down the road to the next step. They thought the business was too risky, or they got stuck on the next step. They knew what to do. They were kind of stuck getting to the next step. Or an alternative would be none of those. I'm still pursuing the idea. I just haven't gotten there yet. And, again, these point estimates this table lines up exactly like the other tables. Black respondents are less likely than others, not more likely than others, to respond that they've experienced these various impediments. And instead, they're more likely than others to say that they're still pursuing the idea. I'm going to just skip over that in the interest of time. Okay, so up to this point, what have we done? I've shown you this difference based on consideration rates and starting rates, and I've tried to just see if that can be dismissed by thinking about differences in optimism, or differences in risk aversion, or just differences in some easy to point to measure, like, oh, I couldn't get financing or whatever, and you don't see anything there. So the next step in the analysis is going to be to try to look at the various steps that people took on the way to launching a business, and try to see what we can see in terms of racial or gender differences in the various steps that people took. So as I promised, we have a long list of potential steps that you could have taken, and I've bucketed those into 4 buckets: socialize the idea, codified the idea, sought market feedback, or undertook logistical steps. And then the way this table is put together, the first bank of numbers is a white versus Black respondent comparison. The second bank of numbers is Hispanic versus non-Hispanic comparison. And the third bank of numbers is male versus female. And I've highlighted this in red because I want to point out that what's going to turn out to be a key difference between Black respondents and white respondents is that the rate at which Black respondents discuss ideas with friends or acquaintances is significantly lower than for the white population of respondents. You don't see a difference there, and looking at Hispanic versus non-Hispanic, and you see the opposite result for men versus women. Jorge, please.
I think so. This is hey, hi David. This is super interesting. Reminds me of this work on urban sociology, right? Where they, William Julius Wilson, Mary Small, etc. They try to understand Black neighborhoods, and their take is that Black neighborhoods, they're structured in such a way that they often don't allow the same level of development of social capital or access to other things, right? So they might have less coffee shops, they might have less connections. And I'm just curious, in my mind, I have that hypothesis, I have a culture hypothesis, and I know you guys don't have that stuff, but but I'm just curious your take amongst those competing explanations, or all of them, or anything like that.
A priori, I think they're all equally plausible. Certainly people in Durham, North Carolina talk a lot about, people used to refer to Durham as Black Wall Street. And then when we built this Durham freeway through the city, it kind of split the neighborhood in half. And many people have pointed to that as an intentional attempt at kind of breaking up the Black neighborhood, making it harder for business to take place there. So I'm definitely sympathetic to the urban sociology explanation you offer. I think there's evidence of it here. I don't know that my data really allow us to to sharpen our priors on which of those is more likely to be true. I'll show you a little bit more in a few slides about sort of what happens when you do talk to people. And so maybe
Okay.
that will help you kind of think about this. Avery.
But David, do you think that because there are fewer Black entrepreneurs, then somebody who wants to start a business, there's fewer people, there's a lower probability of finding somebody to talk to. And as a result, the expectations and the plan would be more unrealistic and harder to carry out. Is that your interpretation?
Well, I need to be a little careful adopting what you said whole hog, because if you look at the third row, sought out an expert you did not already know, you'll see that Black respondents are more likely than white respondents to say that. So it's a little, I wouldn't put it in quite the way you put it, but I think this is certainly consistent with the idea that someone with an idea for an entrepreneurial business perhaps doesn't see their network of friends and acquaintances as a very productive source of feedback. Now, it might be because their friend network doesn't have many Black entrepreneurs in it. It might be that they expect to get negative feedback from them, or I've shown this result to people who study Black business, and some people have come back to me and said, well, in the Black community, sometimes you're reluctant to show an idea that might fail. So there might be some self-screening here where people understand that the idea has some uncertainty around it, and that uncertainty creates a reluctance to kind of share it. I can't speak to which of those explanations is driving this. I'm just simply reporting back what I've learned by sharing these results with others.
David, let me just quickly ping in and say 4 to 5 more minutes.
Yeah, 45 more minutes is perfect. Thank you, Melanie. Because what I'm going to say next is that, you might think that, well, maybe different groups of people have a different idea of what it means to consider a business. Well, it's not the case. It's not the case that the Black respondents are considerably less likely to take steps like writing a business plan or creating a presentation for the business. It is true that they are less likely to say they created spreadsheets or financial models, but on balance, they are more likely across several measures to have taken steps to codify the idea. So it's not that they didn't take the idea as seriously or something. They just didn't discuss it with their friends. And then when you look at seeking market feedback, you don't really see very much in terms of Black-white differences. You do see differences, for example, in male-female respondents, but not across Black respondents versus white respondents. And then when you go down and you look at the logistical steps, here's where, it's not that, going into this project, I think my prior was that I would have expected Black respondents to report a much lower rate of exploring outside financing options, but that's not the case. It's just simply not what we see. If anything, they are more likely to report that they applied to an incubator or a business plan competition. So then those are just univariate differences. They hold up to the same kind of regression analysis that I showed you in the previous part of the paper. So Black respondents are more likely than white males to report that they spoke to no one. They are less likely to report that they spoke to a friend, and they are more likely to report that they spoke to a stranger. Melanie will allow me to run over for a minute because now I'm going to talk about her paper for a second. She has some really interesting work in her learning spillovers paper, where she's looking inside firms where the employees were some employees were previous entrepreneurs, and the question is, if you're exposed to more, if you're exposed to more prior entrepreneurs, Do you get information spillovers that help you become an entrepreneur? And what she shows is that there's not only is there a negative white to black knowledge flow, in other words, having more white entrepreneurs, former entrepreneurs in the business does not lead to higher rates of black self-employment. But it's also the case that there's negative black to black knowledge flow. So having higher black former entrepreneurs inside the firm makes it less likely, not more likely, that you're gonna yourself become an entrepreneur if you're a black respondent in her sample. So very closely connected results in a very, very different empirical setting. So then the thing where I'll close here, because I know we're kind of out of time. Does socializing your idea, how is that connected to actually starting the business? So in column 1, I'm simply repeating the results from the earlier table just so you can see them there. Column 2 restricts the sample to people who spoke to a friend or acquaintance. Column 3 restricts to people who spoke to no one. Column 4 restricts to people who spoke to a stranger who was an expert in that market or area. And what you can see is that the main finding gets stronger when friends are consulted and goes away when experts are consulted. So I think, going back to Jorge's comment from before, I think this kind of helps you a little bit, at least, think about, plausible mechanisms for what could be going on here. And it seems to be that expecting negative feedback is part of the story. Brad.
Yeah, whoops, go back to that slide.
Oh, sure, sorry.
Yeah. Am I reading this right, though? The Hispanic goes exactly the other way for reasons. Are you telling a different story for Hispanics than you are for Blacks?
Yes, I mean, I guess that's what this table is telling you. That's right. You're looking at column 4 and noticing the massive loading there. Yeah, that's right.
I mean, that's the number that sticks out to me, is that for some reason strangers are encouraging Blacks and discouraging Hispanics in really oddly different ways that I don't understand.
I mean, one story might be industry, concentration. Different Hispanics clustering in different types of industries than other types of respondents. But yeah, I see your point. I totally agree with you. I think I'm out of time. So I'll stop there and turn the floor over to Emmanuel.
Great. Thank you so much, Emmanuel. Take it away.
Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this very interesting paper. Let me start a little bit with too much information, perhaps, but don't pay too much attention to my tone or demeanor. I'm recovering from a minor health issue. It has nothing to do with David's paper. All right. Now, when you read this title, why aren't there more minority entrepreneurs? What does that make you think of? For me, there are two main drivers that could contribute to the overall level of minority entrepreneurs. Number one, we might have some frictions in terms of the number of minority entrepreneurs that start new businesses, or we might have frictions in the number of minority entrepreneurs that survive, conditional on starting new businesses. This paper is going to be about the entry process. How does race and gender affect the propensity of minority entrepreneurs to launch new businesses? Now, there are many different mechanisms that jump out when you think about what things might influence the likelihood that a minority entrepreneur or a female starts a new business. Here's a non-exclusive list of some of those factors. David showed in the model, the very simple model that he showed, that essentially starting a business is the product of two things: how productive you think the idea is likely to be, and the amount of capital that you raise for the idea. So obviously access to capital, remember at this stage, when the entrepreneur is thinking about, the potential entrepreneur, I should say, is thinking about entry, they're thinking about their expectation. So it's their expectation of what would happen as opposed to what actually happens in the future. And so if they expect less access to capital in the future, then maybe the product of the productivity of the idea and the amount of capital becomes lower than what they can get from wage employment. And so they decide not to enter. It's also possible that the expected productivity of the idea might depend on how much education or how much skill they have. If they have spent enough time in that industry, then maybe they think there's a chance that they can carry this idea towards productivity. And so then they're more likely, for example, to think the product of the productivity of the idea and the amount of capital that they can raise might lead them to expect a higher future productivity than their expected wages moving forward. Now, it's also possible, like there are just these two quantities in that very simple equation, but some of them do a lot of heavy lifting. When you think about, for example, the theta variable, which is the expected productivity of the idea, it's easy to imagine that as further driven by things like cultural norms and expectations. What does that mean? Imagine if I, when I got into a PhD program, if I had gone and told some of my family members, I want to drop all of this and go to Silicon Valley to start a startup, a lot of them would have yelled at me and told me that that's crazy and absolutely stupid to do. And so then that would affect my expectation of how productive the idea is likely to be in the future. And so you can also imagine a situation where cultural norms and expectations, for example, impact the entrepreneur's own assessment of how productive the idea is going to be in the future. Obviously, you could, through the same prism, think about social and professional networks, right? How likely am I, like the amount of capital is an uncertain quantity. How likely am I to raise the capital that I need in the future? That's a function of my social and professional networks. How large are those would also determine, for example, how likely I am to generate high returns from entrepreneurship. And so when you think about all of these things through this framework, there are some of them that are driven by, all of them come through. So the entrepreneur at the end of the day is going to be the one who's going to make the final decision. But you can split this into a set of factors that they essentially are exogenous to them, and a set of factors, for example, that are their own assessment. David's paper is going to be a lot about the set of factors that are their own assessment, right? What is their own assessment of how productive the idea is going to be? What is their own assessment, for example, of how much capital they can access? So that's how to think about the general framework in the paper. How do you even get data on something like this? As David showed you guys, they're going to be running a survey to essentially elicit responses from entrepreneurs about the different steps of this process. David did a good job, so I'm not going to spend too much time recapping. Just to recap, the biggest driving factor in the difference is this gap between conceiving an idea, so having that theta in mind, for example, and actually going on to launch the business, is really driven by this difference in the ability of Blacks to socialize their ideas. So Black and Hispanics are more likely to consider starting a business, but Blacks are actually less likely to start a business, especially if they are below median income. The differences in expected outcomes, so what is the expected productivity of my idea, that theta variable is unlikely to explain the difference. And the key difference comes from Blacks being less likely to socialize the idea. So I'm going to have three main, essentially, not quite quibbles, but suggestions on how to kind of improve, essentially, how convincing this mechanism is. Now, if you zoom out from their paper a little bit, like I said, the level of minority entrepreneurship, if you're kind of measuring it at a given point in time, that's a flow variable that's determined by two things. What is entry and what is exit? And so most studies are going to focus on the intensive margin, conditional on entry. What does differential access to funding look like post-launch? To what extent is that some kind of pipeline problem? So a supply of minority entrepreneurs as opposed to a demand side problem, which is frictions in access to funding that's driven by providers of capital. To what extent is the pipeline problem? So if you think about the extensive margin of launching a business, To what extent is that created by systemic factors? Remember, this exogenous set of factors that the entrepreneur could not do much about, as opposed to the set of factors that's created by the entrepreneur themselves. This paper is about unpacking the pipeline problem and relating it specifically to the set of actions that the entrepreneur is taking. And so the big takeaway, if you zoom out here, is that policy interventions that improve, say, mentorship programs have the potential to improve the rate of Black business creation. Like I said, my suggestions are going to be three main suggestions. The one is kind of thinking about, why not a follow-up survey to kind of unpack the mechanisms behind this lack of socialization. In what ways can you use some of the data that you have better to kind of help us think through the magnitudes of some of what you're showing us, especially some back of the envelope calculations. So if you think about the extreme, suppose we said, we're going to fix the socialization problem 100% and make sure Blacks socialize their ideas with the right people. How much of a gain, for example, in business launch should we expect, for example, for Black entrepreneurs? And then, I felt like there was some opportunity to use even some of the data that you currently have to kind of tell us a little bit more of a richer story around this socialization. And that's how I'm going to proceed now. So why are Black founders, or again, potential entrepreneurs, not socializing the idea? Here is again, non-exclusive list, right? For example, is it something to do with trust? Remember those 4 factors I showed you earlier? Maybe cultural norms and expectation. Maybe I just have this, experience where every time I tried to share my idea with someone, maybe they nicked it. And so maybe someone might copy me. And so if I'm afraid that someone might copy me, for example, then I'm less likely to share the idea. This is something that a follow-up survey, for example, asking them some of the reasons why they did not socialize their idea might help you kind of narrow down the mechanisms through which this is happening. Maybe I am more likely to start new businesses, for example, that are tailored to the needs of my community. And so maybe people outside my community might not really understand me as well. And so maybe I'm less likely, for example, to share the idea with them. Somebody kind of brought this up. I believe it was maybe, Brad or Ravid, who talked about like lack of representation. Maybe I just don't know a knowledgeable expert to share my idea with, at least a knowledgeable expert that I'm already familiar with, as opposed to an outside expert that I'm not familiar with. But again, like you said, this is probably not the whole story, as the gap kind of exists for those employees that work at startups that you would expect to have this essentially exposure to entrepreneurship, although that can cut both ways, right? As an employee of a startup, it's also possible that you have a restricted equity, for example, and you're waiting for the company to exit to get this liquidity event to go start the startup. And so that might tie you down even further. And so it's not clear how important that argument is for this particular point. I talked about this cultural norms aspect. If I share it with people in my community, they look negatively on self-employment, except if my wage prospects are very bleak. And so maybe people in my community might try to discourage me. Or it's also possible that there's some stereotype threat, which is, if I pitch my idea, maybe you're going to reject it. That's going to confirm some negative stereotype about my group. And so the way I'm going to protect myself, X, and T, is by choosing not to share at all, right? And so putting all some of these factors, eliciting maybe from the sociology literature, which of these factors are more important, and investigating them in some kind of follow-up survey, I think adds to the richer narrative of kind of understanding the importance of this socializing channel, and like you say in the paper, is important in terms of thinking about potential policy actions that might want to increase the rate of minority entrepreneurship. Now, this is not picking on the results per se, but it's something that I had a little bit of a hard time understanding. So if you look at the table 3 that you showed, the main gap in terms of socialization was really driven by this propensity to discuss the idea with a friend or acquaintance. You also had that gap of discussing with a friend and acquaintance with expertise, but it was a lot narrower than just talking to a friend. But then the final table showed that talking to a friend is not as important for the likelihood of business formation. It seemed like what was more important was talking to a friend or acquaintance with expertise or talking to a stranger. And so if talking to a friend is not that important, then it becomes a question of, okay, is that 2 percentage points, for example, from channel number 2, really driving the whole gap in the difference in business formation as a function of this lack of socialization, right? Toward how important is the difference between talking to a friend or acquaintance with expertise and talking to an expert that you do not know in terms of translating into eventual business formation, because it seemed like those were the 2 important channels, especially when you showed how these things relate to the rate of conversion. To conversion meaning going from having the idea to actually starting the business, by actually making a sale, quitting your job, or hiring an employee. Now, suggestion number 2 relates to this back of the envelope calculation I was talking about. Like, tell us a little bit more about the relative importance of the 4 main factors. What 4 main factors? You kind of group them very nicely, right? You socialized the idea, you codified the idea, you sought market feedback, and you undertook logistical steps. Now, from the undertaking logistical steps, remove the part about like incorporating the business, because I feel like that might be very mechanical in terms of like the people who actually follow through. It would be nice to have some kind of benchmarks. I'm thinking about some benchmark regression of how these factors actually contribute towards the conversion of going from having an idea to actually starting the business, because then that would help us understand what the relative importance of socializing the idea is. If you think about like a policymaker, you want to be able to allocate your time productively and effectively, and knowing essentially the weight of this socialization with the caveats that is not causal, right? It's just is associational. At the very least, it would help us understand how, give us a back of the envelope calculation of how much improving this socialization might improve the rate of Black business formation. Now, the third suggestion is, is using some of the data that you already had, essentially to give us an idea of the different things that might be driving this socialization gap, which is kind of, I thought, the main takeaway and the main mechanism that you were showing in the paper. What do I mean by that? Now, I went and looked at some of the survey questions that you had in the appendix, right? And it kind of talks about, it has this really neat question about, tell us how you came up with the business idea. And it has some questions that get at whether or not you had a co-founder. Now, in my own work, what I've noticed is like, when you look at Black businesses that were actually formed, they're less likely to have co-founders, right? So to what extent is this socialization gap maybe driven by the fact that if they're going at it a solo, maybe in your sample, they're likely to have more or less co-founders, that is actually affecting how they are dividing and conquering and actually driving the gap in socialization that you are observing. Right. And so being able to understand how this relates, for example, to the socialization gap is something I thought would be pretty easy to add to the paper. Now, and then this other question about, which of the following best describes the business idea you considered most seriously in the 5 years, that could also help you get at, for example, if the type of idea, for example, is related to the rate at which the idea is socialized. So if you're coming up with ideas, for example, that are specific to addressing needs within your community, and you end up not having a lot of members of your own group within, for example, your community to share the idea with, that might also help point you towards the mechanism that is driving this essentially delta in socialization. Just to make sure I don't go over time here, I think it's a cool paper with important implications that can shed more light on racial gaps in entrepreneurship. 2 ways to think about it: very extensive margin. Do you enter or not? Conditional on entering. What is your access to funding? This is on the very extensive margin. My main suggestions are, again, let's understand the mechanisms better by maybe adding a few more survey questions, right? Exploring reasons why Blacks are less likely to socialize the idea. Quantifying essentially the importance or the impact of socializing your idea to understand what the relative impact would be, for example, of improving the socialization rate. and essentially using the available data that you have to understand how co-founders or the type of business might relate to this socialization gap that you document. I really learned a lot reading the paper, and I look forward to reading a revised version soon.